Today, we finish our last week of our series, and it's this conversation that is around this question. It's if God is good, okay, if God is love, if God is good, why is there suffering? And this is the conversation we've been having for the past few weeks. If God is really this God of love, if God is really good, why is there all this pain, all of this evil, all of these things going on in the world? And we've been diving into this together, looking at responses and asking why. What can we find from this question? Because it's a very valid and real question. But today, what we're going to talk about is we are going to talk about the moments and the times in life when answers are not enough. You know what I mean? We've been talking about responses to this question, answers to this question, but what about when things just don't make sense? Because it's not reality to think that everything is going to be nice and tidy and you can have the answers to everything. If you've lived on earth for 5 minutes, you know that is not real life, is it? So what about when things don't make sense? What about when answers are not enough, when responses don't mean anything? You ever been there? You ever known somebody who was there in a place of real pain, real hardship, real injustice, where all of the answers in the world and all of the things that you could say did not mean anything because it didn't matter? Today we're going to look at the story of Job, and you might know Job. This book in the Bible is one of the places in the Bible that deals with this question of suffering and pain. And if you know the story of Job at all, he, at one point in his life, he lost it all. He lost absolutely everything. He lost his family. He lost his health. He lost his business and resource. He lost his home. He lost absolutely everything. And so what this book is of Job is this series of kind of back and forth conversations. A lot of it is actually poetry. A lot of it is poetic. But it's this back and forth conversation. First, it's back and forth conversation between Job and his friends who have come to, quote unquote, comfort him. But the truth is, they do a horrible job, okay? They do a very bad job coming to their friend Job. And so Job, we're going to jump in today, and this is our verse that we're going to start with in this conversation. He says this in verse 16 to his friends. I love this so much. He says, I have heard many things like these. You are miserable comforters. Have you ever wanted to say that to some friends at some point? He just said it. He said, all of you. He says, will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on arguing? I also could speak like you if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you. But, he says, my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. And then he ends this way. Yet, even those things, if I speak, my pain is not relieved. And if I refrain, if I don't speak, it does not go away. In 1952, there was a guy named Clive Staples Lewis, or otherwise known as C.S. Lewis. And he met a lady named Joy Davidman. And they were both, right off the outset, you got to know something about these two people. They were incredible minds. Like some of the smartest people. Clive, so C.S. Lewis, he was obviously a scholar. He tutored and taught lectured at Oxford and at Cambridge. And after being an atheist for most of his life, At 33, he became a Christian, and he was one of the most influential writers and thinkers of the 20th century. He later went on to write some of the books that we know, like the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote he wrote a lot of them. He wrote Mere Christianity, and he wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. And in this book, you can imagine this Oxford and Cambridge scholar. He tackled this problem of pain and responses and why God would allow these things. And his writings are so incredibly influential. But I would say, though he was just amazing, I would say Joy was actually more impressive. See, Joy Davidman, she was an author and a poet, actually from America, but she was kind of like an actual child prodigy. Like, it is said that she actually broke an IQ test score in elementary school. I'm not even kidding you. And she got her master's in literature at Columbia in only 3 semesters when she was 19. And she was a brilliant mind, to the point where we actually think that she had photographic memory. She was in a play of Shakespeare at one point, and she was able to recite all of her lines by reading through the script one time. And she was an incredible and brilliant person. And she wasn't a Christian. And she did not grow up in a Christian household. She was not a follower of Jesus. But later in life, Joy, she had a moment in her room. And she was going through a very, very difficult time. This is a very dark season in her life. And in one of the lowest moments of her life, she had this experience that she writes about in her room. And this experience, she basically says in her room, she says, only those who know God would know this. She said, in that room, I met a person. And she goes on to explain, it wasn't like somebody physically appeared there in front of her, but it was like in her consciousness. And she said, in my room that day, I met a person. And she said, a person so real that all my previous life was, by comparison of that moment, like a shadow play. It was like fake. Nothing I've ever experienced or seen was more real than that moment. But at that point, she didn't know who or what she had met in her room. And so what did she do? She actually went around and she explored all sorts of religions. And as a brilliant thinker, she had access to so many things. And she went and explored all these different kinds of places. And she said she found them all empty. Until one day, she stumbled upon a book by a guy named Clive Staples Lewis, or C.S. Lewis. And his book, she stumbled upon 3 books of his, and as she read them, she was convinced for the first time to read the Bible. She says, all right, I'm gonna give the Bible a chance. And so she does. She opens up the Bible, she begins to read it, and she begins to read the Gospels, the story of Jesus. And what she says when she reads the stories of Jesus is incredible. She says, it was Jesus who I met in that room. Absolutely amazing. But it doesn't end there. And so as she's reading the Bible, she just starts to realize that it was this God who had come to meet her. And she continued reading some more books from C.S. Lewis. And eventually they had a mutual friend through Oxford. And eventually this friend convinced her. He's like, hey, you know what? You should write him. You should write C.S. Lewis about your thoughts and your questions about his books in the Bible. I'm sure he would love to read them. And so she builds up the courage, right? Joy at one point builds up the courage, and she does. And she writes him a letter, and she starts asking him questions and sharing her thoughts about the books that he's read and about God and about faith. And what happens here is it starts just this incredible 2.5-year friendship of 2 brilliant minds talking and writing back and forth about life and about faith for the next 2.5 years. And what this did is it led to them meeting in London, at Oxford, where C.S. Lewis was, and their relationship kept growing and growing over the years. That kept getting closer, and that is until Joy became really sick. She actually, at one point, became diagnosed with cancer. And she was given a few days, at best, a few weeks to live. And so, on her deathbed, C.S. Lewis calls in a favor from a priest that he had helped. And C.S. Lewis calls this priest over, and he asks him, hey, will you do two things? Will you pray for her healing? But two, will you marry us? Because we would love to be married. And so the priest came, and he did. And he prayed, and he anointed her with oil. And then he married them. And they, in that point, became married. And so what happened was, as she was sent home by the doctors to die, she could just die at home with her new husband in her bed, she made an incredible recovery. And for the next, it was amazing story. She actually was able to enjoy her marriage. She was actually able to get up out of bed. They started traveling. They went around and they enjoyed their marriage. It's so funny. C.S. Lewis, he writes this beautiful line. He says, it is so interesting to have at 59 the joy that most men have in their 20s. And then he ends it with this line. It's beautiful. He says, thou have saved the best wine for last, talking about Jesus. And they just got to enjoy this beautiful, beautiful time together for 3 years. Because the cancer did come back. And this time, it took Joy's life. And what this does is it turns C.S. Lewis' life upside down. And he would later release a book called A Grief Observed, which was not actually written as a book, but it was written more of a journal. It was actually never meant to be released. And later, he released it, but anonymously, so that no one would know that it was him. And he did so because it was his journal of the most raw and real thoughts and doubts and difficulty that he was going through at the loss of his wife. And what is so crazy is to see in this journal this brilliant mind who wrote the book, The Problem of Pain, who had, during World War II, one of the greatest radio programs that was bringing hope to an entire nation, pointing them to God. You see through these journals the real doubts and difficulties of what it looks like to deal with real pain and heartache. He even says this. He says, we were promised sufferings. They were part of the program. We were even told, blessed are they that mourn, and I accept it. I've got nothing that I hadn't bargained for. Of course, it is different when the thing happens to oneself, not to others. And in reality, not in imagination. See, there is a time when explanations are important, but there is a time when answers are not enough. and what we have to do, church, and what we have to talk about in this point is the central theme and the central most important thing when it comes to our faith and this question is that the response of Christianity to this question and to this problem is not just theories or thoughts or beliefs. It is a person and a relationship with none other than God himself. And so, why can you trust God when it doesn't make sense? How can we trust him when we come to this point? When we come to this point where we don't understand. We don't know why. We don't understand why. When the real life hits. When answers stop mattering. When responses don't hold the same weight. How can you and I trust God? And that's what I want to talk about today. How can we trust him in the real? All right, and I want to talk about a few things. And the first thing I want you to know is this. I'm going to say it and then I'll explain it. You can trust God because if God is great enough to end evil, he is also great enough to know why he hasn't yet. Let me explain. Job, in the verses in the story that we read, he faces this suffering, right? And he begins to cry out to God. And then what do his friends do? They come and they answer responses. And they actually start arguing with the man about why he's suffering and giving him responses and answers. And they do a horrible job. And so Job, you heard his response to them. You're all horrible comforters. And so they go this back and forth. And then what happens at one point is God himself responds to Job. And he comes up to Job and he does something very interesting. God, in his response, he doesn't give him an answer. He actually starts by asking Job a question. And actually many questions, actually chapters of questions, but they're all pointing and hinting at the same thing. And he says this in chapter 38, God asks him, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" And here, God starts to do something very interesting. What he wants Job to do is to think and to consider about who God is. God begins pointing Job to himself, to think on, to consider in this problem, in all that Job is going through, to consider God and his wisdom and his greatness. See, I recently had to do the same thing to my daughter. What? Yeah, I recently had to do the exact same thing. See, we recently had to take my 5-year-old daughter, Scarlett, to the pediatrician. And at the pediatrician, we knew that she was due for a shot. And she really did not want to go. She really did not want to go to the pediatrician. She did not want to get a shot. I remember hating them when I was a kid, right? And she could not understand why we would make her go. She could not understand why we would bring her to this place, no matter what reasons we gave her, what explanation we gave her, what answers that we were giving to her, right? She could not understand. It did not make sense to her. And you could point out, you could say maybe it's life experience, maybe it's age, maybe it's perspective, right? But we as parents know that sometimes we have to make decisions our kids might not understand. And so there at the pediatrician, she was sitting up on the little thing. She was crying and she was yelling and she was causing a real scene. And I had to look at her and I had to look in her eyes and I had to hold her and I had to say, "Scarlett, trust me, I love you. And if I, an imperfect father, with an imperfect perspective and point of view could ask this of my daughter, how much more can we ask? Could God ask this of us, right? How much more should we expect God to have greater perspective, right? To know more, to see more that we possibly can't understand. This is probably what Paul was talking about in Corinthians when he said, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now, we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And this is what God is trying to get Job to see. And here's the question. Here's the question. Shouldn't we expect this if there was really a God? Shouldn't we, if there was truly a God, shouldn't we expect that God be unique, that God be transcendent, that God be beyond us? And if he is God, and if he is beyond us, could he not have good reasons that we can just not see or understand? Tim Keller puts it this way. He does it so well. He says, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways. And so now you might be here in the room, and if you're like totally honest, you're thinking, okay, so what you're saying is trust God because he's God. Awesome. Thanks for the non-answer. like, great, cool. Trust God because he's God. Okay, sweet. Thank you. I guess I'll go home now. But you got to know two things, okay? There are two things that are very important that you need to know. First thing you've got to know is this. You've got to know faith is not unreasonable. And the second thing you've got to know is this is not where we started. This is where we're ending. Okay, the first one. Faith is often talked about as it's something only really unreasonable people will have. It's often talked about in our city, in the debate about God. It is often pictured and talked about as if it's like believing in fairy tales, right? The statement is literally made. We don't believe in the tooth fairy. We just also don't believe in God. That's literally what they say. Faith is talked about as something that just this belief, this faith that you have that can't be proven. You can't hold it as strong or as real as something that can be tested and proven, like science. That's how it's talked about. A few years ago, the interesting thing is, I was watching Stephen Hawking, and if you know who he is, he's one of the greatest scientists of our time. He is a genius, a brilliant man. He was presenting on TV. I was watching him present his theories for the beginning of everything. Okay, that's a big deal. He was talking about the beginning of it all, the beginning of everything we see, everything we can touch. But what I found very interesting was at the very beginning, as he was about to start and go talk about the beginning of everything, he uses this phrase. He says, by a huge string of luck. And then he continues to talk about his theories about how everything began. And don't get me, he's a genius, a brilliant scientist. I just thought that phrase was really interesting. Or Richard Dawkins, who we talked about before, who calls God fiction, or he calls him an imagination, right? He said that one day he is a scientist, right? Richard Dawkins is a scientist as well. He says one day scientists may or may not solve the Big Bang. What I find interesting is that his whole view of the world, that there isn't a God, rises and falls on a natural beginning to the universe. And yet, it takes some faith for him to believe it. It's not solved. The only interesting thing is about 10 years ago, quantum equation has actually started saying again that there actually might not even be a beginning to the universe. So who knows where that leaves us? N.T. Wright puts it this way. He says, science is never simply the objective collection of neutral, just middle, down the middle, totally like no biases of neutral data. It always involves imaginative leaps to hypothesis. Conversely, Christian faith is never simply believing a bunch of impossible things on no real evidence. Real science and real Christian faith are much more like one another than many people suspect. How? How is that true? How is that possible? How? Well, one, you got to know, this is not where we started, but this is where we end. This is where we're ending. See, we've been together over the past few weeks on a journey as a church. The first week, what did we see? The first week we saw why we have good reason to believe that this conversation does not point us away from God, but points us actually to his existence. Why we have good reason to believe that God is creator, that he has designed and made things with a purpose, right? And the second thing, what did we see? The second week we talked about how we have good reason for believing that God is all loving, even in the face of evil and of pain, that evil does not prove that God isn't loving, but that he actually is, that he truly desires and is the God of love. And if you missed either of those, find them on our website. But see, we can't just know that he exists. We can't just know that he is God, right? But we got to know who this God is. In order for any of this to make any sense, you've got to know his character. You have to know him. See, one of the most natural things about us as humans is that we trust when we know somebody cares. Isn't that the truth? When do you extend trust to somebody else? You and I, we extend trust. We can trust when we know and when we believe that somebody has our best interest in mind, right? And this is why we didn't start here, but we end here. Where? Trusting when we can't understand. Trusting when we cannot see, because we have good reason to do so. We have good reason to trust God, who is transcendent, but is also love. A God who is near to the brokenhearted. A God that actually knows your pain. A God that became human, walked amongst you and I in a full body and experienced our pain himself. This is why Peter in the scriptures can say, cast all your cares on him, for he cares for you. And I want you to know that you can trust him. And not only that, but you have good reason to trust him. You have good reason to believe that he is there even in hard times. You have good reason to believe that he is loving and caring even in the face of suffering. But here is what you need to know. The goal is not that you stop there, okay? The goal is that you experience it, okay? Because when things don't make sense, when things don't add up, when the reasons stop meaning anything, the only thing that will matter is trust built through relationship, is trust built through knowing. This is why the ultimate invitation, church, of Christianity is not a belief, but a relationship. Yeah, come on. There are certain things you can only know in relationship, in closeness. If you're a nerd and you're on the logical side of brain, this is called non-propositional knowledge. It's a thing. For example, I can sit up here and explain my wife to you for hours, can't I? I can tell you how she's funny. What does funny mean? I can tell you that she's beautiful. What does beautiful mean? I can tell you that she is the most incredible mother. I can stand up here and I can explain and list out attributes of my wife for an hour. But I would not be able to come close in expressing my real knowledge of who she is because I know her. Because that knowledge can only be truly known by you being close to her. One of the interesting things that these people have found, there's just this brilliant writer, and he talks about how one of the interesting things that he has found is that in the places of the world where there is the most suffering, where people are actually going through really horrible and terrible things, what he has found is that in these places, this question is rarely or if ever asked. The interesting thing is he has found this question is mostly raised and asked and brought in first world countries in the West. And counterintuitively, what he has actually found is that in these places where there is real and actual suffering, they have found there that some way, somehow, they have found that those people have the greatest confidence in the goodness and in the love of God. And when I think about my own life for a moment, and when I think about my experiences, and when I think about the things that I have gone through, you know what realization I come to when I think about my faith in God and my trust in God? I come to the realization that my strongest convictions of God's care, of God's goodness, of God's faithfulness, and of His presence in my life, do you want to know where they come from? They come from the hardest moments of my life. My strongest convictions of God's presence, of God's provision over my life. Do you want to know where that comes from? That comes from the days of my life where I was providing for my family on a Dairy Queen income. And every day where we were thanking God for the meal, it wasn't just a Christian thing to do, but it was actually a miracle that we were eating. And that we were actually thanking Him and praising Him that He was our provider, because otherwise it would not have been possible. That's where my conviction comes. I realized in prepping for this message how kind of weird it is, but also kind of profound it is that I didn't even realize it, that I call that one of the hardest seasons of my entire life, I call it a gift in disguise. Because I knew God, experienced God in a way I never would have otherwise. and what you've got to know today is there are certain things about God's goodness, about his love, about God's response to suffering that can only be known by knowing him. By inviting him into your life, inviting him into your suffering, and experiencing him. Going through it with him before, during, and after. And this is what I've been wanting to do. Okay, this has been the point and the goal of everything, is not to point you to a theory, but to a person. And this is exactly what happened with Job. When God reveals himself to him and he shows himself to him, Job ends with these words. He says, "My ears had heard of you, but now," in chapter 42, he says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." And for Job, this seeing changed everything. And church, this is the message of our faith, that you and I can know God. This is our faith, that because of Jesus, that because of God that came to earth, literally was visible among us and with us, because he made a way through the cross, through his display of love, through his suffering, through his resurrection, his defeating of all of the things that are causing humanity to go astray and cause evil and suffering, through his victory. All humanity can know not a theory, not a belief system, not certain things that you agree with. Humanity can know God. This is the gospel, the good news of our faith. And in knowing him, church, we can trust him. Here in the middle, when things don't make sense, when we just can't understand, we can trust him. And it's here in the middle because he has not yet gotten us to our destination. I once heard a story, and the band could come up. I want to close with this. I heard a story about someone who was on a flight, and as the flight was beginning to land, during the descent, a baby started screaming and crying in pain. And, during the descent, and then the person says, during the descent, I could feel kind of the discomfort, right, in my own ears. Everyone around was swallowing and trying to pop their ears, but the baby just kept on screaming. And so what this person did is they turned around and to see how the mother was handling it, right? And what he saw when he turned around is he saw the mother holding the baby to her chest with her head leaned back and tears running down her eyes. And what I wonder is, as this mom is just feeling the pain of her child just screaming and yelling, I wonder if she was thinking, how do I explain to this baby that soon we'll be at our destination and the pain will be done? And it reminds me of Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. If you know the story, Jesus' best friend had just died. And when he finally shows up, because see, they had called him days before, and they'd said, come, your best friend is about to die. Come and do something. And he didn't show up. And so when he finally does, they begin to ask him, why weren't you here? If you would have been, God, if you would have been here. God, if you would have just blank. And the writer tells us that Jesus speaks to them of a promise about the future, about how death will be gone and the resurrection. But then he does something interesting. He goes and he weeps. Jesus goes and cries. And here you see a God who knows that pain will end. You see a God who knows that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. But yet he weeps. And I can imagine, like the mother holding her child, Jesus feeling our pain and our suffering, wondering, how do I explain to them that one day we will reach our destination and the pain will be gone? See, church, because tears are part of our stories, aren't they? But our eternal destination point is hard to explain because we only know time. And we cannot fully or truly understand eternity. And here's the truth, the problem of pain and of suffering in the world, and this question is in part a question about how much current reality we see. And right now we don't see it all, but we can trust him. Right in the middle, when things don't make sense, we can trust him because he's the God who still weeps, because he is the God who cares. He is the God who right in the middle did not exempt himself from our pain, who in the middle came and experienced it, who in the middle is love and is faithful, and the God who we can trust because he is love, because he is faithful, because he is not detached or uninterested. We can trust that he will get us to our destination, where pain won't have the last word, where everything will finally be made right, where every tear will be wiped away and everything finally redeemed. You can trust him. Paul puts it this way in Romans. We know, and we do know this, don't we? That the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, you might be a Christian, a follower of God, who have the first fruits of the Spirit. We have the down payment of that destination in the Holy Spirit, in his comfort, in the presence of God, in God with us, in us. We who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope, church, we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. Celebrate.